Okay, well, again, I'm Zach Bleicher with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and I lead the IFAD office here in New York. And it's really happy to welcome those of you in person and those of you online. Thanks for joining us. Those that are here in person are enjoying light plant-based lunch. Hopefully you at home or wherever you are doing the same. If you're not, go ahead and grab yourself something to eat, and we'll be happy to engage you in this discussion. For those of you that don't know, IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development, as I said, and essentially we operate as a specialized agency of the UN and international financial institution. That means that what we do is we invest in rural people, empowering them to increase their food security, improve their nutrition, and raise their incomes. And since 1978, IFAD's founding, we've provided around $23 billion US in grants and low-interest loans to projects that have reached about 518 million people in that regard. So before shifting to the discussion, maybe just a few words from where we sit. We continue to live in a world where around 3/4 of the poorest people live in rural areas. Most of these people depend on agriculture, yet too often they remain hungry and poor. And climate and volatile food and energy prices have the potential to push millions more into poverty and hunger by 2030, the expiration date of the SDGs. In fact, since 2015, the year of the SDGs adoption, we've seen hunger numbers increase, not decrease, suggesting that something is truly wrong with our food systems and our methods of production and distribution. We know that small-scale producers are essential for our food systems. They produce around 1/3 of our food. Yet in this volatile climate, only 1.7% of climate finance is reaching them. And this is also in a context where food systems are responsible for over 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Last year's Food Systems Summit led to an increased recognition that our daily choices of what to eat based on availability and access touch us all. It underpins our cultures, our economies, and guide much of our relationship with the natural world. And it's been encouraging to see the outcomes from the summit and also leading to what we may call the first food COP. So there's the UNFCCC discussions happening in Sharm el-Sheikh right now. Lots of new and exciting opportunities for action are emerging. And action couldn't be more urgent based on what we've seen in the years since the Food Systems Summit, given the cost of living crisis, food, fertilizer, energy prices that are plaguing really the whole world. The need for action also doesn't undermine the need for dialogue and understanding. That's really the point of today. Really, we want to continue to do this. Makes this kind of thing all the more urgent. So something we'd like to do with this our little way here in New York is to try to continue to have discussions like this. It's the first one we do, and it's a really great one to do with Philip here, to talk about his new book, 60 Harvests Left. So I'm going to introduce Philip, and then we'll really take it to him for a discussion, and then we'll have he's going to present to us, and then we'll have a discussion after. So Philip Lymbery is the global CEO of Compassion in Rural Farming, and as I said, the author of the new book, 60 Harvests Left, How to Reach a Nation in the Future. As well as being the CEO of Compassion in Rural Farming for the past 17 years, Philip is also a UN Food Systems Summit 2021 champion. He leads the Shifting to Healthy, Humane, and Equitable Livestock Systems Coalition, which brings together a broad base of civil society organizations to inform and educate about the global imperative to resize the livestock industry within safe planetary boundaries. This new book takes its title from the chilling warning made by the UN that world soils could be gone within a lifetime. The book, which was released on the 1st of this month by Lymbery USA, promotes ideas discussed at the Food Systems Summit, who were part of the discussion around negotiations at the UNFCCC COP27 last week. So Phil, really have to turn the floor over to you and for your presentation. Thank you.
Zach, thank you very much for hosting today, and thank you for coming in. Whether you're in the room or on the screen, your presence is hugely appreciated, and really looking forward to our conversation together. So, as Zach has rightly said, my name is Philip Lymbery. I'm the Global Chief Executive of Compassion in Rural Farming. We describe ourselves as animal welfare environmentalists. It's a new phrase which, for us, encapsulates the idea of putting animal welfare within the bigger context of issues surrounding food, climate, the environment, and poverty. That's what we want to do. We want to see animal welfare not as a distinct niche set out on its own, but integrated as part and parcel, actually as an integral part of the solution to many of the problems that are facing the world right now. Compassion in World Farming was hugely privileged. It was a great honor to be chosen as a champion, an ambassadorial champion for the UN Food Systems Summit last year. It was not only an honor, but an obligation for us as an organization that prides itself on collaboration, on constructive engagement. We were outspoken about those who took a different pathway. Other NGOs within our community decided to protest against the UN Food Systems Summit, to host a separate event, which we felt was folly, to say the least. We wrote this, we said this, and that continues to be our stance. We believe that the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in calling the Food Systems Summit, probably instigated the single most important milestone in getting global recognition of one of the most important words within the food system debate right now, which is the need for transformation. And I feel that what the UN Food Systems Summit did last year is embedded that word transformation, the need for food systems transformation in the common lexicon of governments. You could see it in the speeches made by the 163 governments that spoke during that event hosted here in New York. I think the next step, we're looking forward to the stock take, we're looking forward to the SDG Summit 2. The next step is really to map out with governments, for governments, what that transformation should look like. And for my small part, that has been the motivation behind writing 60 Harvests Left, to try to give some idea as to what, certainly from our point of view, where we see that transformation leading. So I wonder, Travis, if we could just pop the slides on, please, and let me just give you some insight. Thank you. So most of the pictures, by the way, are my own, and I'm privileged to live. Sorry. It's okay.
There we go.
I'm privileged to live on a farm hamlet in the south of England. This picture here is behind our home. We live on a hamlet, so it's not our farm. We live within the farm. So we have all the view and none of the work, which is great, right? 60 Harvests Left is based around the structure of the 4 seasons. The summer the summer season is the first one. It feels like we as a society are living as if we're in an endless summer of consumption without boundaries. But we're starting with the climate emergency, the collapse of nature, and the continuing spectre of hunger, the growing spectre of hunger in the world's poor. We're seeing the leaves turning to autumn. COVID-19 gave us a view of what a perpetual winter could look like for us as a species, as a society, as a global community. But what I want to focus on is what spring could look like. The solutions that are already there, out there, all coming down the tracks that we can use to create a sustainable future for humanity across the planet in harmony with animals, whether they be domestic or wild. Next slide, please. I know New York is a fantastic dog-friendly city. It's wonderful to see everywhere you see it. So I thought I would share this picture of our dog. This is Duke. He's a rescue dog, and we go out every day into the fields and the woodlands around our home, and we get to see the rural community. We get to see the countryside in all of its glory. Next slide, please. Our neighbors are 40 cows, wondrous creatures that live a joyous life feeding on the rough grazing going up and down the river valley next to our home. Next slide, please. It gives us a great front row seat in agriculture to see the good, and there's much to be celebrating, but also to see the not so good. And one incident that I'll tell you really quickly that comes to mind on the not so good. There was a story where I remember seeing a tractor pulling a plow in a field. We'd walked quite a way, so it wasn't right by our home, but a tractor pulling a plow, and it was going up and down, and it was spring, and of course this has been an age-old scene in the countryside for many years. Only there was something wrong on this day. We could see that the plow was literally ploughing a lonely furrow. There were no birds. There are no gulls looking for an easy meal of worms in the upturned soil. And when I looked at the soil, because the plough went across a footpath, and I took a bird's eye view of the soil, and I could see, just as it had been upturned, I could see nothing. There were no worms or bugs or other insects scrambling to get back into the world just turned upside down. This field was being planted with an intensive crop, maize, corn, being grown using artificial fertilizers and pesticides, which of course was diminishing the soil, was destroying the biodiversity of the soil. And it was pretty much sad. It was so lifeless, we could have been walking on the wall. Much of this corn is fed to cattle and other industrially fed animals around the world, or cars. That's the global trajectory for industrially reared corn and other crops, to be quite honest. And I remember seeing in Nebraska, in the Midwest here in the US, of course, I remember seeing cattle in feedlots. I remember seeing the corn that they were feeding on. I remember seeing the animals in dusty pens without a blade of grass in sight. In the Nebraskan summer sun, really intense heat without any shade. And I watched as they jostled to try to lie down in each other's shadow to get some respite. That was life on an industrial farm. Next slide, please. So it made me realize that there are two sides to factory farming. This is the industrialization of agriculture, where chickens are kept in cages so small they can't stretch their wings. Other chickens being reared for meat, packed in their tens of thousands, made to grow so fast that they often become painfully lame for much of their lives. Mother pigs unable to turn around in farrowing crates for weeks, maybe months at a time, and cattle being taken out of fields and put into mega units. Next slide, please. Quick picture of a cattle feedlot in Idaho. This was actually taken. I planned to take this picture with a drone. I planned to go to Idaho and take this picture with a drone, but I could not because of COVID-19. So I got over my technophobia. I used Google Earth. This is a Google Earth screenshot. It enabled me to find that actually, whilst the US has inspired cattle feedlots around the world, sadly, it does not have the biggest on the planet. At least from my research, the biggest I found was in South Africa, south of Johannesburg. Was it feeding hungry people in Africa? It was geared to the export market for the Middle East and China. Next slide, please. So what we can see is that industrial agriculture is causing great cruelty to animals, but it's also a major driver of wildlife declines. It's also integral to the climate emergency. Food, as Zach has already said, contributes about a third of greenhouse gases. So it's a big contributor The livestock sector contributes more greenhouse gases than all of the direct emissions from the world's transport put together. And on top of that, what industrial agriculture does is undermines the very thing that we need to produce our food. It undermines the soil, which is why the UN has warned that if we carry on as we are, we have just 60 years left in our soils. No soil, no food, game over. But it gets worse. Even if we can find another way to make food, soil does three things for us as a global community, essential ecosystem services. The first is it produces 95% of our food. The second is it holds carbon. The soil around the planet, healthy soil, holds twice as much carbon as there is in the atmosphere. As it becomes degraded, it releases that carbon into the atmosphere. If we were to do it a different way, it could sequester lots of carbon. The third thing, which is often overlooked, is that soil is pretty much the only thing that stops the world's rainwater from flashing off into rivers and disappearing back out to sea. It holds water against gravity for thirsty crops. Yet it is disappearing at a rate of knots. And was the UN right to predict 60 harvests left? At the time, yeah. But the calculation on which that prediction was based was made 12 years ago. The reason why we used it as the title was because it's an iconic assessment. It shows that time is running out for the kind of food system transformation that Antonio Guterres spoke about in inspiring the UN food systems. So change is inevitable, whether because of impending climate change or collapse of nature or the disappearance of our soil, whatever you hang it on, big change is coming. So what does finding our way to a new spring look like? Next slide, please. Well, to my mind, it's based on 3 R's: regeneration, rethinking protein, and rewilding, not least of the soil. The first, regeneration, is about switching from industrial agriculture, which undermines the poor, exacerbates global hunger issues, and destroys the soil. Move away from industrial agriculture towards a regenerative way of producing food. And what this means is getting animals out of those factory farms, far fewer of them, but getting them back on the land as part of mixed rotational farms. It also means supporting the infrastructures and the livelihoods of small-scale producers that depend on their age-old sustainable practices for their livelihoods. So regeneration is so important, and in this way we can not only give animals, as an animal welfare organization, give them their best life, where they can experience the joy of living. We can help bring back biodiversity. We can help replenish soils, which is much needed. We can have land that sequesters carbon and stores water. We can essentially have it all and create more nutritious food in a way which is pro-poor, pro-animal, pro-environment, pro our children's future. The next R, next slide please, is rethinking protein. And this is about looking at the fact that if we carry on eating more meat every year than we've been doing in the previous year, if we carry on that trend line, most of that meat coming from factory farms, that's the big driver. Factory farming drives overconsumption of meat, which drives more factory farming and so on. If we carry on like that, then our food alone will trigger catastrophic climate change. So what do we do about that? Well, we need leadership from policymakers at the UN level, at government level, at corporate level. Leadership to encourage diets that are more balanced and more healthy, more plant-based diets, as well as the development of alternative proteins, such as cultivated meat from stem cells grown in a bioreactor, which has a fraction of the land use requirements, much less greenhouse gas and water use. Another protein type that's coming down the tracks is precision fermentation, where microbes can be programmed in a vat, added with ingredients to produce precise food ingredients, precise molecules, protein molecules, without the greenhouse gas emissions, without the land and water consequences of our current industrialized agricultural system. Next slide, please. The third R is rewilding. Rewilding the soil. Thank you. And here, next slide, please. What I'm actually advocating is that we bring back the elephant. What I mean here is not that big 5-ton animals with long trunk and floppy ears should be wandering around the fields or even the parklands here in New York. I'm not meaning that at all. What I'm saying is that we should be bringing back the elephant's weight of biodiversity that should be under every soccer pitch sized piece of healthy farmland. And how we do that, how we bring back, so every football pitch should have 4 million worms, not looking like sand with no worms, like the one which I saw close to home. It should have 13,000 species. That's real biodiversity. Forget looking at Mars, let's look at the soil. All of that biodiversity should add up to 5 tons, roughly equivalent of an African elephant. So how do we do that? Well, essentially by regenerating the countryside. So the 3 R's are a circular package. Bring the animals back on the land, out of factory farms, reduce their overall numbers so that we've got healthy diets that are sustainable. And in this way, we can restock the soil. Because if we don't, then it won't just be climate and the collapse of nature that we're worrying about. There will also be, where the hell are we going to get our food? So that is why I think the Food Systems Summit was absolutely on point. I felt that Antonio Guterres, in his leadership statement, that we've got to stop the war on nature, that we've got to transform the food system, was absolutely the quote of the century. I paraphrased it. And next slide, please. And that is why I believe that, just poke it again for me, please. Thank you. Here is the man himself. It's time to change how we produce and consume food, including to reduce greenhouse emissions. Transforming food systems is crucial for delivering all the sustainable development goals. And I would say, going further, it is crucial if we are to stop climate change. If COP 28, 29, 30, however many we have, if they are going to mean anything, we've got to transform the food system. Same with biodiversity. If the CBD is to mean anything, we've got to transform the food system. Food security can only be delivered through transforming the food system. Next slide, please. I just wanted to mention, if you could again just tap that for me, please, that next year we are bringing together some of the leading thinkers and advocates from around the world on this subject at a conference called Extinction or Regeneration. It'll be on the 11th and 12th of May 23. I've already had confirmation from Stefanos Foutoi, who is leading the coordination hub, the work outpouring from the UN Food Systems Summit. He will be taking part, and we are privileged that he will be part of that conference. Next slide, please. So essentially, 3 R's, regenerating the countryside, rethinking protein and rewilding, not least the soil, could at first, well, I think it's a common sense way to go. But I think that just with putting out there that we need to transform the food system, it's an idea whose time has come. But it's an idea rather like this parent sooty tern looking down at her egg. When I took this picture, I didn't realize, next slide please, that this egg was hatching. And whenever a new idea or a new birth hatches, it looks a bit gawky, a little awkward, like this one, a little bit incomplete, if you like, because they are. It needs to grow up and spread wings. Next slide, please. But I believe that with a 3 R's approach, we can transform the food system to a sustainable and thriving future for all the world's people and for generations to come. Next slide, please. Oh, try again. Thank you. I'm running out. What we do now is never mattered more. So let's lift people out of poverty, animals out of suffering, and future generations into a bright and livable future. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Will. Thanks for that really excellent presentation. I've certainly got a couple questions, but maybe we can open it to the table first. In case there's, of course, there's online through Zoom. People ask questions. How, Travis? Sorry.
They can just unmute or raise their hand.
So unmute, raise your hand. We'll recognize you from here if you have any questions. But maybe we'll start first with people in the room. I see a question right here.
Hi, my name is Camano Rivera from Manor Campaign Mexico chapter from Mexico. So my question is the following. From the sessions from what you have conveyed, the infrastructure of farm ecosystems, which a municipality that I'm working with, Tepeaca, Puebla, is trying to reintegrate damaged environmental acres of land, part of its 2024 farming infrastructure. How that would integrate with live cattle and farming ecosystems that's already been damaged by pollution. How can that regeneration be integrated back into the ecosystem biodiversity?
Thank you. Well, it sounds like a fantastic project. And I think the key to it really is to bring the animals back to the land, as it sounds like that you're doing, without overstocking. So making sure that the animals are kept at the right number, not too many, and crucially moving them around the land in a rotational basis. It may be permanent pasture. I'm not too sure of the context, but if it's permanent pasture, then moving them around, perhaps with other species following. So cattle followed by sheep, followed by chickens would be one possibility. Or if it's a mixed farm, moving around followed by crops, with the grass being the rest period. That's really, really important. I think avoiding the heavy use of chemical fertilizers, so artificial fertilizers and pesticides. Essentially, the restoring landscapes means moving to a nature-friendly way of farming. It sounds like that's where you're going.
Yeah, the deep institution itself that takes care of part of that. Farming, it's trying to avoid chemicals and pesticides.
Right.
So more of a regenerated integration with recyclable foods and wastes in a more inclusive environment that's already been damaged. How to re-infrastructure that? If part of that can be in collaboration with the municipality and with your expertise, can we make that possible?
I think so, yeah. I'd love to hear more, and if we can help, then we absolutely will. It sounds like a great project. And I think the wonderful thing for me about nature-friendly regenerative agriculture, farming, is that it can be scaled up without harming the environment, either by either by individual farms being big, because as long as you're farming in a nature-friendly way, it doesn't matter how big the farm is, right? But the other way to do it is to bring together lots of small producers, small landholders, and to have them working in a cooperative so that they're all working in harmony. That's another way to create regenerative landscapes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the CBD, and of course the upcoming COP15 is happening in December. So I'm curious to know what has been your engagement there, or IFAD's more broadly. I followed the CBD negotiation here in New York, and of course at New York level, it sometimes can feel very abstract and far away when you're taking note or appreciating, and it feels not so concrete. So I'd be very much interested in hearing your thoughts on the big one.
Sure. Well, compassion in world farming, we have had limited engagement at the moment with the CBD because we're relatively small but international charity. So a lot of our focus gone to the UN Food Systems Summit, gone with climate change talks, and also with UNA. But CBD is really important. For me, the situation is this. What we know is that over the last 50 years, the world has lost 69%. 69%. So, put that another way, in the 50 years since the industrialization of agriculture, most of our mammals, birds, amphibians, fish, reptiles have just disappeared from it. If we carry on as we are without reforming the food system, a child born today, baby born today, his, her, or they will reach their 18th birthday in a world where our wildlife is on course, statistically, to be at single digits or zero. So that is why, A, the CBD is so important. So conventional biodiversity is so important. The second is it points to the fact that without food systems transformation, the CBD, along with other important conventions, will just fail. The Sustainable Development Goals will just fail. So the single biggest thing we can do is move to nature-friendly farming as a matter of urgency. If that helps.
So, I'll have a question,
Please.
if you don't mind. Maybe I'll ask it in two parts, listening now. So, one really compelling case you laid, I think, was the kind of shifts that you're. So I guess I'm interested in two levels. One being sort of a UN employee. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about, building on the last question, a bit more about what's the sort of policy engagement, so a bit more specifically, in terms of what the kinds of things you'd like people to see shifting. And then second, I guess it's also then how that translates into action. So you talked about transformation. Another word you and leadership is using lately is about transitions and transitions in our own systems, and really what those really tangibly. So you put a big ask on the table,
Yeah.
you know, and so I'm curious to how do we make that action?
Yes. So I think the first thing is that organizational, our big focal points for engagement over the next 12 months will be the SDG summit, will be the food system summit follow-up, will be COP28 climate talks, climate summit. Those are going to be three key interventions. We will also be building towards UNEA 6, which of course is here. So we're building towards UNEA 6. These are really important. So United Nations Environment, the sixth gathering. So those are the important touch points for us. And the ask at the climate talks is, let's put food and farming on the agenda, because at the moment it isn't. As you quite rightly said, food is responsible for a third or more of greenhouse gases, but doesn't get a seat at the table, doesn't get discussed on the agenda. So let's put it on the agenda at the climate talks. For the Food Systems Summit follow-up, let's begin to work with governments in a constructive, engaged way to map out what the transformation needs to look like. For me, the transformation, in a nutshell, is moving away from the industrialized approach of agriculture. So moving away from chemical pesticides, artificial fertilizers, cages, grain feeding of animals that don't need grain feeding. Remember that cattle and sheep, they eat a lot of human edible food right now. They've been evolved millions of years of evolution to just eat grass, things we can't eat. So they can convert things we can't eat into things we can. Here we set them up with a grain squandering competition. And in that, I can put a figure on what, from a food security point of view, what effectively this shift can do in terms of a opportunity lost as it currently is. The industrial rearing of animals, which I would define as the grain feeding of confined animals, those animals consume enough human edible food to feed 4 billion people on the planet. In other words, enough food for half of humanity. Half of humanity. And they waste most of the food value in both calories and protein in conversion to meat, milk, and eggs. So it's a big opportunity. So moving away from industrial to a regenerative agricultural landscape, much less reliant on high consumption of livestock. So that would be the specificity that I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the jackhammering outside. It's not the most pleasant way to have a productive discussion.
It was quiet for a while.
Yeah, indeed. I guess they took a lunch break like us. They heard my call. Any other questions before we maybe?
Just a thought,
Please.
and I'm 100% in agreement about the problems with industrial and with animals. But we also have to respect plants, and we have to understand the nature of plants, because so we're doing industrial plantings in agricultural areas. What I've been trying to do and advocating is creating families of plants. It might lower production, but it also will create a structure within the agricultural area where there'll be a healthier production of the soil, because as we both know, soil is going to disappear as we know it within less than 10 years. Yeah, so even though we're talking about 60 homes, we're talking about a real crisis going on with the soil at this given moment. And we have to really address plant, and we have to create my feeling is we have to create a a balance between plant life and human life. I mean, we're all part of the system,
Yeah,
and it's not the idea we have to applaud this increase of population. We have to question, why are we increasing the population?
I could
And,
not agree
and, you
more.
know, with the detriment of animals and plant life disappearing, which ultimately will evolve into destruction of this planet for humans, not for other species, but for humans.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm in agreement with you. I just think we should talk more about plants and their respective there.
Sure. No, I totally agree. And I think one of the things which often gets lost in the conversation is that plant-based foods need to be regenerative too. Because you can't have plant-based foods, certainly not in terms of fruit and vegetables, if your soil's gone. So plant-based, you're absolutely right. And so in terms of coming back to specificity, what does nature-friendly look like? It is actually a plant-friendly and animal-friendly way of farming. So it's about leaving the soil alone as well. So moving away from heavy plowing, preferably to no plow, so no till, and having different plants, as you say, families of plants.
Because they do talk to each other, they do communicate.
Right, right.
You know, the latest, I mean, I've always felt that way growing up as a child, but, you know, they've now proven scientific.
Yeah.
They do communicate.
Sure.
There's no reason why they shouldn't.
Yeah. And using those families of plants, not only as part of the mixed rotations, but as cover crops, to make sure that the soil isn't left naked, right? It wants to be left naked when it's raining or really windy. That just leads to soil diminution. So these are really, really important ways forward.
We both agree.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So maybe before we move to close, I'll ask you one, I'll challenge you a bit,
Great.
just for fun. You know, the basic critique that comes from the Eatlands report, summit last year, is looking at it from a developing country perspective. And that, you know, meat basically is a highly efficient form of delivering protein and other nutrients for people. It's an important source of income for people. And it sort of calls for these shifts of diets are sometimes viewed as a very northern perspective of things. It isn't responsive to the needs for people in development.
Sure.
How would you respond to something?
I think that what the Lancet report actually shows is that globally we need to reduce our overall meat consumption, meat and dairy consumption by 50 to 60% by 2050, which means that here in North America, we need to take a leadership role to reduce by 80%, preferably on a close timeline like 2030, which is challenging, right? What it also means is that not all nations or regions of the planet are equal in their overconsumption. What you're getting at is that in some countries their consumption is below the average. So you can argue that there may be more need for more meat and dairy consumption in those countries. The key thing is that in the high consuming nations, there is a reduction, a serious reduction, so that our overall average comes down within planetary fitting boundaries. And I see part of the solution here in North America, in the US, where people are eating a lot of meat and they want to eat meat. They don't do it because they don't like it. They want to. So why not give them meat without the downsides? So this is where cultivated meat, grown in a bioreactor from stem cells, without the slaughter, without the destruction of the environment, could really come in and be the renewable energy equivalent for food here in the US. I think in more developing nations, it's the shift is much more about avoiding industrialization taking hold, avoiding the rural livelihoods that are based on small holdings and sustainable farming, avoiding them going to the wall. So it really is a pro-poor, or at least a pro-lifting people out of poverty and saving livelihoods agenda. Because the one thing that we do know, this is what I say in South Africa. So I was in South Africa 10 days recently launching the book. What I say to them there is there's a real problem in South Africa with rural poor and with unemployment. And the way to make both of those worse is to continue to roll out industrial agriculture. It wipes away livelihoods, it impoverishes people that can least afford to be impoverished. So that's how I would answer your question.
Okay, no, it's interesting, and it really underscores sort of, when we talk about alternative pathways of development about climate, it actually really fits quite neatly in that. Right? We're asking should and for us to develop differently, but that maybe comes with other conditions. I see a mysterious hand on the screen.
It's like Michael.
Michael, do you have a question or see a yellow hand?
Stepped away.
Well, it's invited to submit a question in writing another time and you can respond. But unless
Yeah.
there's any other questions in the room, we can move to close. And we really appreciate you coming out with us and really nice to meet you. Right. Well, thank you very, very much.
Zach, thank you.